Wow, it's really coming down out there. Come on in. I'll take you to your table. Yeah, dry off for a bit. I'll go get the chefs for you.
Hello, welcome in.
Welcome to A Minor Diner, where we take a recent music release, give it a theme, and pair it with two other works of art to create a three-course meal. We got an appetizer, an entree, and a dessert to make our meal du mois, our meal of the month. I am your trouble chef, Jesse, and beside me is our base chef, Zach, and he's eating the biggest slice of humble pie right now.
What are you talking about, Jesse?
Well, you see that guy out there, the guy out where our new parking lot is going to be?
Are you still on about the parking lot? And I'm looking out the window and no, I don't see any guy.
That guy
who's not there
is the surveyor from the city here to survey so we can build the parking lot. So I believe an apology is in order.
For what?
For doubting me and forcing the good people of this establishment to risk their lives just getting here.
There's no guy out there.
What do you mean? The guy out there he's in the Hawaiian shirt.
If he was a surveyor, wouldn't he have a vest and surveying equipment? Did he have surveying equipment?
Just introduce the meal.
You didn't give him money, did you?
No, just Social Security.
What?
Social Security.
You gave him your Social Security number?
Our Social Security.
Our? You gave out our social... How do you even know my Social Security number? You gave it to a guy in a Hawaiian shirt? Why?
He asked. Who asks for Social Security? The city. I thought... Just talk about the meal.
What would make you think some random guy...
He introduced himself with confidence, Zachary. Speaking of which, this month's Meal de Moi, our theme is arriving with style. It's hard enough to introduce yourself to someone new, whether it be a client or a friend of a friend, and feel like you came off like the intelligent, one-of-a-kind, amazing person you know you are.
Unless you're our treble chef who is impressed by anyone with a Hawaiian shirt, even when it's not Hawaiian shirt season.
I'm an empath, Zach.
But imagine trying to make that same perfect first impression, but to the entire world. We were inspired this month by an exciting, spicy sample platter from a young Ghanaian Australian gourmand. He goes by Genesis Owusu, and we've paired his debut album, Smiling with No Teeth, with a 1955 suspense film and a 1959 Broadway play. Speaking of arriving with style, coming to the table right now is our appetizer. All right, for our appetizer, we are going to time travel back to the year 1959. Okay, back in 1959, there was a woman named Lorraine Hansberry whose debut play was debuting in Broadway. It was called A Raisin in the Sun. Hansberry was only 29 when the play premiered. She was the youngest American, the fifth woman, and the first black playwright to win the Best Play of the Year award of the New York Drama Critics. A Raisin in the Sun was the first play ever written by a black woman to be produced on Broadway, and it was actually the first with a black director as well, a man named Lloyd Richards. Sadly, during the run of her second play, A Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, cancer claimed Lorraine Hansberry at age 34. A quote from Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Her creative literary ability and her profound grasp of the deep social issues confronting the world today will remain an inspiration to generations yet unborn." Which is true, because here we are in 2021, still talking about it.
Yeah, that's the main thing, because I hadn't read all of Raisin in the Sun until recently. I had only been familiar with like the general Cliff Notes, and it feels, because like you said, 1959 predates the actual civil rights movement.
Yeah.
There's just the seeds there. But then also, it is an insanely funny play. Like, it's very funny. It's very I know we like to think of people in the past as not being as enlightened or as humorous as we are, but it is very sharp, and it is very, very competent in a way that isn't of its time. It's sort of evergreen in that way. And it's interesting to hear that I didn't know that Martin Luther King specifically had that commentary on her work.
Yeah.
The play is about, essentially, to boil it down, there is an African-American family, and it's not just a nuclear family, it's kind of an extended family as well.
Few generations.
Yeah, living in a pretty small Chicago apartment. And none of them like it there, and none of them like their lives, and it's less to do about the huge socioeconomic, racial problems of the day. Of course, that's what they talk about in the play, but it's literally, I don't like that the kitchen is kind of like a walk-in closet. Like, this doesn't work
And
for
the
me.
roaches, the roaches are bigger than my child is, kind of thing.
And it's really interesting to see how they all have like a different, because it is a microcosm of whatever you want to call it, the African American experience of the time, or even just the American experience of the time, because it's post World War II but pre 1960s, and so there's a boom, but there's not really a boom for everybody. Like, some people are going out to the suburbs or whatever, but the people stuck in the cities, specifically African Americans, it's not what I find most powerful about the play is that let's say you were to do this today, and not even in a nihilistic or pessimistic way. If you were to do this today, you might try to step a bit too far over the line and, this character represents this kind of person, and this character represents this kind of person. And Lorraine does that, but she does it in such an organic way to... like, I feel as if I am Walter, even though I'm not Walter's age, and I feel like I am his son, and I feel like I am his wife and his sister and his mother and things like that.
It does a really good job of, so the characters, as I'll kind of talk about in some more detail later, they all kind of are representing the Black American experience in different ways and what they feel about being a Black American. So they represent something, but at the same time they feel like real people. Like, they feel like somebody that you've met. And it's really well done in that sense. But we're just let's start at the top. So the theme is arriving with style, right? And reading the play right off the bat, it's awesome how she describes the apartment itself, right off the bat. And apparently, because the version that I have most recently read is the unabridged cut, basically, because they made some cuts in the first showing, opening, the
first
opening,
run,
the first run of the play. A lot of it was because this is a play about African Americans. I don't know if these white people would want to stay for 3 hours. So this version of the play, that is the most recent one that I read. Apparently, a lot of these stage directions are Hansberry's herself, but some of them are from the original director as well. But just with that aside out of the way, the apartment right off the bat is described this way. Its furnishings are typical and undistinguished, and their primary feature now is that they have clearly had to accommodate the living of too many people for too many years, and they are tired. All pretenses but living itself have long since vanished from the very atmosphere of this room, which is such an interesting way to describe a room. And it's you sit down to read the play, and this is how it starts. That it's before you've even met these characters, you already have this idea of what we're getting into.
Yeah. And I would say, in regards to that, especially a stylish entrance has to have some degree of confidence to it. And just as a sidebar aside thing is in screenwriting or playwriting, the playwright is king in theater, but the director is king or queen or whatever you want to say in film.
Mm-hmm.
And so in screenwriting, you're taught to like, don't do any of this. Don't direct from the page. Don't put the pretentious flowery language in there. And even in plays, Shakespeare's famous for having like 4 pieces of like stage direction isn't in his entire career. Like A Bear Enters, I think, is like the main one, because it's like I can't imply that through their dialogue.
Yeah.
And so when I was reading this, immediately like alarm bells were tripping, because she also starts it with opening on like an alarm clock going off.
Uh-huh.
And every student film in existence starts with that, of a black and white shot of an arm hitting the alarm clock.
Totally.
And so to start something so... I suppose the cliche doesn't exist at that time, obviously, but she very, very confidently says, this is exactly what I'm going to do. And I was very moved by that section that you read, where she describes the apartment itself as like it's a very tangible thing. Inanimate is the word I'm looking for. But then describing the people that we haven't even seen yet, she describes them as being tired.
Yeah.
And it's like sort of the only table setting that you need.
Exactly. Like, to describe a setting itself as tired, like the furnishings in the apartment as tired. It's like, once we get to know these characters, it's like, oh, actually this makes perfect sense. Like right off the bat, that's just, and I know I read it as kind of weird, as it's like, oh, well, why are there this many stage directions for something that is just is barely even going to be shown to the audience.
Yes. But
if you're just reading the screenplay, would you call it a screenplay?
I used to know, because I did some plays over in China. I can't remember, but it's script at least.
The script.
But it's I can't remember exactly what it is play-wise, theater-wise.
Showing my lack of... I was a theater kid in high school. I should know these things.
It's better to lose some of these details. The words on the page, whatever they are. Yes.
The words on the page, the script. It does kind of perfectly set you up for to get to know these characters. And the characters, just to kind of, if you're not familiar with the play, multiple generations. The kind of main couple, I guess you could say, because there's a mother character who is the mother to 2 children. One of them is named Walter. Walter is kind of a lost soul, I guess you could say.
Yeah, he's parking cars, or he's a valet.
He's just
a
like
doorman.
a valet parker or like a limousine driver.
Or yeah, that's it. He's a driver. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's a driver for rich people, and that's kind of what he does. And he has dreams of opening up a liquor store. But everybody else in the family is like, "Oh, Walter, your dreams that are stupid."
Yeah.
And then there's a daughter named Benny. Benny is a nickname for her, but she kind of represents, if Walter represents like the lost soul of like, I'm a little bit older, I have just no clue what I'm doing with
Jaded.
my life, basically. Yeah. Like, it's jaded, like life has got me down.
Yeah.
And his wife Ruth is kind of very similar in character to that it's like, well, we can't expect a heck of a lot at this point because nothing's really worked out so far, and why would it start doing so?
And she mentions that again, like you're saying, because again, that's a rule of like screenwriting, script writing, playwriting, is like, well, you can't just describe 10,000 things that the audience is never going to be able to infer. But she describes Ruth as that, of like, she was pretty and she's still pretty, but she's not going to be pretty for much longer. Because she's starting to understand that life isn't going to happen to her.
You can see it in her eyes,
yes,
which is like an interesting thing to like, because you've got to find an actress that now fits those characteristics. But like, it makes sense with the character afterwards, right? And the daughter, we've got Walter, and then Walter's sister named Benny. She kind of represents like the hopeful youth, where she's in school to be a doctor. She's kind of trying to find her own identity based on her African heritage. She doesn't want anything to really do with this kind of, poor working class atmosphere, while also not being. She's a little pretentious about it, but not like horribly pretentious about it.
Yeah, and it's like it's sort of again entering in with competence and style that she immediately portrays her, because it'd be very easy for the audience to get on her side of like, I reject this pessimism and this jadedness and whatever.
Yeah.
But then all the other characters are like, yeah, because this is like your mission of the week. Like you wanted to be a horseback rider, and then you want to play guitar.
Yeah.
And like you're very temperamental in this way, where you're constantly finding a new hobby.
Which is really interesting, right? Because it's, I try to think about, as I am a white man, and it's kind of different in the sense that it's like when I was growing up in a relatively wealthy household, it's like, oh yeah, I want to play guitar, Mom. Buy me a guitar. And the kind of the vibe is like, well, you can do what you want to do, and you take one karate lesson, but then you decide that you don't want to take karate. That's totally fine. It's just not for you, But that's not really the vibe in this household. Growing up with like, they're struggling to find this like 50 cents basically very early on in the play, and it's like, you want 50 cents for school? Well, too bad.
Because Walter and Ruth's son basically like epitomizes this of just, I want to do this. Well, that costs 50 cents and we're not doing that. Okay, well then can I go work to get that 50 cents? And no, you can't, because it's going to be too cold and we don't have the,
Yeah, like all these things. And so you really get kind of the lack of opportunity right off the bat, where it's like, oh, well, even hobbies, hobbies are a waste of time. Hobbies are a waste of money, because how is that like getting you towards any sort of end goal, which is a really different experience from like what I had growing up. But basically, so there's these main characters who have their own kind of dreams, and these dreams are about to be shifted because the mother character, because the father of these of Walter and Benny has recently died. Basically, he had shitty working class jobs his whole life, and he's essentially worked himself to an early death is the implication here. But his life insurance premium is now coming in the mail the next day, and it's $10,000, which is $10,000 more than they've ever had in their pockets before. And so the whole play kind of revolves around like, what is this $10,000 going to do for this family? Whose dreams are going to be forwarded by it, and whose dreams are going to be destroyed? And like, is this money going to corrupt the spirit of this family in any way? And she has this, what I appreciate about her take is that it's not cliche. It's weird when you get things like this. Like, you're pulling a play out from over half a century ago, and you're seeing something that isn't cliche, but then eventually became cliche, if that makes sense. So what I'm getting at is like, money corrupts. And money does this and that and whatever. But she doesn't touch any of those. She touches the actual like human being aspects of it. That Walter is the danger here, that he's going to get a bunch of money and then buy a bunch of liquor and become a drunk. No, he wants a liquor store. He wants to be an entrepreneur. And then Benny, is she going to try to be some like fashion designer or some sort of weirdly idealistic thing? No, she wants to be a doctor. And the Ruth is saying like, well, no, because black people aren't doctors. You can be a nurse, but you're a bit insane for being a doctor. There's a quote like early on that Walter says, and the other characters kind of parrot, because he's apparently said it hundreds of times, like, ain't many girls who decide to be a doctor. And it's interesting that, like, yes, we've kind of touched on already that it's like, okay, Hansberry as the first black woman playwright in Broadway, and really forging a path for African Americans in the future of this industry. But she's also doing the same thing for feminism. Like, this is before second wave feminism even hits, and it's an incredibly feminist play. It touches on like kind of that intersectionality piece, which is like really a really large piece of feminism now, but this is 1959. Like this isn't really even part of the conversation at this point. Like women's rights and minority rights are kind of different conversations, even in the 1960s. Like they're related, but they're different conversations.
Yeah, and I think, especially in regards to that, the intersectionality thing, because I think it's insanely obvious as any third-party figure. If I'm commenting on a country that I'm not from or a people that I don't belong to and things like that, it is, no matter how hard you try, you kind of tend to view them as a monolith. So Europeans are this, and Asians are this, and Africans are this. And she has this incredibly good take that I find as being like, just, you can read this any day of the week, any year, is that the people inside of an ethnic group or a minority or whatever you want to identify yourselves as, they're all trying to like hold each other down and refusing to recognize each other's intersectionality because like I was like cheering when Benny was like, well, you know, I don't really believe in God. Yeah. And this is like this is the first time the play like screeches to a halt and everyone's like, well, wait a minute. They can't, yeah, like wait. And they all have that. Like each one of them has something like, well, you're not black because you're this. And they're all like trying to get each other to define what it means to be black. And then it was like the most intellectual version. Obviously it predates it by like 40 years, but I felt like I was watching like the most gritty reboot of like Fresh Prince or something, because it was like the third party characters that would come in. So like Benny's two suitors, the one that's like I'm not sure what the term would have been at the time, but the one that's like he's very black but he's trying to be very white. He's like, I'm the New Yorker.
He is the voice of assimilation.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
His name is George. He's in med school with Benny, and has a pretty funny quote that I wrote down, that it's like he because Benny wants to talk about issues with George. Benny wants an intellectual mate. And George is like, what the fuck? Just like, stop.
Yeah.
You're a woman. Why are you thinking like this? And George is talking about school. And like Benny's in school to, learn and to kind of, expand her thought process. And George says, it's simple. You read books to learn facts, to get grades, to pass the course, to get the degree. That's all. It has nothing to do with thoughts.
Yes.
And it's like, I am in school because I am a middle class black family, or a middle class black man, and this is what is expected of me to like maintain that course, essentially. It's never like, oh, I want to be a doctor to cure the ills of my race, which is kind of what Benny is coming at it from. But it's really interesting how each of these characters is, because you're talking about race as like a monolith, that we are almost, it's like a tendency, but almost even an inevitability that like many humans see, Asian people as this or black people as this because of the stereotypes and the experiences that they've had. But we kind of forget that like the monolith affects the people inside the monolith as well.
Yeah.
Right? Where there's a lot of quotes in the play of Walter like blaming the race for his problems, where it's like, oh, we are the worst race, and this is this and this is that, and that's the reason that I can't succeed.
Yeah. Because there's two things with that. Because like, yes, that the monolith sort of imposes its power, because a monolith is like a two-way street. Like I would argue in America, it's a pretty obvious, like there's an oppressive force and there's a force that is being discriminated against. But both of them are choosing to define, like there is the white monolith too. Because there's that moment there. It sort of reminded me of the autobiography of Malcolm X, when he kind of talks about his earlier days when he was Malcolm Little, talking about the insane like acidic stuff they would put in their hair just to get it to look white. And so like that's the other thing is like that George isn't like a caricature because he's not wrong. Like I know plenty, and I'm sure you do too, plenty of people in Asia that's like, I mean, you can kind of pick your passions after a couple generations. Me here now, there's a John Adams quote or something where he's like, I have to learn politics and statecraft and this and that so that my kids can learn mathematics and physics so that their kids can learn arts and music and things like that.
It's the next step kind of philosophy.
And so George isn't like I think he comes from a wealthy family, but maybe he's only second generation. And so he's like, I mean, I'm black in America. I need to get the grades to get the job to get the money because if I just pursue something like you're saying, I can't just decide to become a horseback rider and have that fail because it's going to cost me everything. And so there's this interesting, like Walter all the time is so frustrating. And I've read other people's takes on Walter because he's kind of that figure, right or left, black or white, whatever, that's just like, whatever's going on right now, I'm going to be the enlightened one to point out why that's wrong. Yeah. And like his first impression, speaking of first impressions, is like he comes in and he's sort of diagnosing the problems with the black race. Yeah. And I say that because that's what he says. He's like, the black race this is everything that's wrong with the black race. And he's like, the problem is that we're held back by small-brained women or whatever. Yeah. And then Benny walks in. She's like, I'm going to be a doctor because I'm more eloquent and I'm smarter than all of you. And he's like, this is the problem with the black race. Whatever. Constantly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's this interesting, that's what I respect the play for the most because as I'm sure specifically Americans, because I think Europe touches on this because they touch Asia and the Middle East and Africa, but America is a very multicultural, multi-ethnic. Like that's the point, is that we're that experiment, and there is a artistic competence that an audience likes to see. We like to explore that sort of cultural diaspora, like here's how different communities interact in this and that. But especially as of 2021 or the last decade, there's like a very big chasm between, it might, like for example, for me, I like Hamilton. I think Hamilton's fine. I am, and I'll get to this in a second, there's a lighting designer guy that I knew that used to work on Broadway. But like Hamilton to me is one of these, it is not a raisin in the sun. And it's not my place to say that, but why I say that is those tickets go for quite a bit. And it's just this this sort of recasting of historical figures as whatever, which inherently I'm fine with, but at the end of the day, that's IP, that's intellectual property, that's relying on whatever. And it's touching all of the buttons of, there's racial and cultural issues in America since our founding, and it just sort of touches them all the time in a way that appeases, like John Lennon said, the people down, I can't remember, in the seats, clap your hands or whatever, and the people up in the rafters shake your jewelry or whatever. It's sort of, that's how I feel about Broadway. But then it's incredible, like you said, her being this pioneer, this true trailblazer on Broadway that is the definition of like speaking truth to power. Because like you said, I don't know if a bunch of white people who are affluent, because there aren't unaffluent people in 1959 going to see Broadway plays. Yeah. I don't know if they're going to want to listen to this. And she presents it, what I found, sort of like I think we've talked about before, is when you're making an argument or a thematic point, you have to like address the counter argument or whatever. Like they might be wrong, the people who don't believe what you believe, but you have to at least acknowledge their side. And I liked being able to put myself in the shoes of an audience member who's like, well, they can just pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they can do this and that. And it's like, look, that's all they're doing. Yeah. And she's touching on every single angle of everything that you say that black people should be doing. They're all doing this, and it's not working, and it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because of where they choose to live. They're in Chicago. Even like Walter says that. Like there's no difference between Chicago and New York. Yep. And it's insanely timeless, I find.
It's insanely timeless, and it's crazy because it's like 1959, and not a heck of a lot has really changed, I guess, in a lot of ways. So, kind of interestingly, I didn't know this until doing research for this meal, but Lorraine Hansberry's father. So basically, everything that's happening here is based on reality because her father led a lawsuit, Hansberry versus Lee. He moved the family to a predominantly white neighborhood, and something called I forget the name of that, but there's like organizations basically in each of these neighborhoods that
like
are
welcoming committee is what they kind
yeah,
of
yeah,
put
yeah,
it in
yeah.
quotes.
Quote,
Yeah.
in quotes, welcoming committee was basically like, nah, you can't move here. You can't do this. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, where he won, but it was a really shallow victory in the sense that it like, yeah, you can live here, but we're not gonna change any of these laws or anything. Like this isn't we're not gonna end segregation right now. And like in the 1940s, it says half of Chicago's neighborhoods were effectively off limits to blacks because of these Chicago Housing Authority welcoming committees per se. But then they're exacerbating the problem by only building public housing in predominantly black neighborhoods, further amplifying segregation. Real estate agents at the time were encouraging white homeowners in majority white neighborhoods that then were, that African Americans were coming into these neighborhoods. Real estate agents were telling these white people, saying like, oh, well, because of this, the value of your home is going to drop. So you should get out now while you still can, move to the suburbs, right? So segregation again and again and again is getting worse and worse and worse. And we're still seeing this today, like the ramifications of these laws and these decisions back in the 1940s, 1950s are still having a lot of ramifications today. To simplify it in the most simplified, dumb way, and this is an oversimplification in any stretch of the way, but north side of Chicago, more white, more wealthy. South side of Chicago, more black, less wealthy. Okay? Again, oversimplification. But if you are in the north side or the Loop, which is kind of like central Chicago, if you live in a neighborhood in these areas, within a 30-minute train or bus ride, you have up to 700,000 jobs available to you. If you live in the south side, if you want to find a job within a 30-minute commute on public transit, you're down to 50,000 jobs. Like that's massive.
Yeah.
And so we've got these neighborhoods that have been, predominantly black for a long time, but the people who live in these neighborhoods that then become successful, they leave the neighborhood. So we're left with, nobody wants to open a business in these areas. You don't have jobs available to you in these areas, and because of this, you don't have like the money to get out of these areas, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of people who have no idea of the reality of these situations are like, well, these neighborhoods in Chicago, why don't they just leave them?
Yes.
And it's like, because of the reality of the situation, they can't.
Yes, that's like, because it reminds me of this, like, I try to metaphorically apply this old adage to like every aspect of life. There's this old, I can't remember how old, but saying of like, okay, if you know nothing about the Civil War, it was about slavery. If you know like a ton about the Civil War, it's about states' rights and industrialized North versus agriculture South. If you know everything there is to possibly know about the Civil War, it's about slavery. And so it's one of these things where people find there's two traps in that you can like, okay, well, if I don't learn anything about anything, it's exactly the same conclusion as if I knew everything about, someone else has distilled down a general point.
Yep.
And if I get into the weeds of it, like I think that she does in A Raisin in the Sun, it's because that's what I feel is most resonant about it today, where I've never been to Chicago, and I live in an apartment now, and I guess there's similarities between an apartment I had in Beijing and that one there, where I wasn't happy with it. It's a completely different situation, but I related to it as like growing out in the rural countryside, whatever. And I don't feel that Lorraine is, to talk about her on a first name basis, I don't feel that
our friend,
yes,
the friend of the diner.
Show. Yeah. I feel that this is one of those important, like Martin Luther King himself. It's like, it's not really going to do me much good to bludgeon Asian Americans or white Americans or Hispanic Americans to death with like, here's the problems with my monolith, my culture, whatever, and here's why your problems don't count, whatever. Like, she very, very clearly says, okay, here's all of the problems that you have. Anyone under this watermark in America has all of these problems. Now watch what happens when these black people try to address them. White people, you wouldn't have encountered the welcoming committee. Yeah. And, Hispanic Americans, I guess they're not as many in Chicago in the 1950s. So like this is the people who left the South, because that's what Mama says, is that they used to live down South. And it's kind of very nice how she introduces that fact in this weird sort of way that Grandma wants a garden. And it's like this weird, like half poetic. And I had to like stop and think about it for a second. It's like this weird, like a woman, because this is the 1950s. And so she's the matriarch. And so the son is about 10 years old. And then there's the next generation. And then there's mom. And I'm like, well, okay, mom's parents must have been slaves then.
Yeah.
Like there's not a way around it. Yeah. Or even, I'm not quite sure how old she is, but pretty close to that. And she wants a garden. And there's an interesting like, well, yeah, because any human being ever wants a garden. It's like a naturing good thing. But she's like, I want it like how we had it down south with like green space. And I find the mark of like true great art, because we get that today every 30 seconds. This is a really important work of art. This is so important. It's so important what this is saying. And it's like, okay, you're putting the cart before the horse. Like you need to let it settle and actually feel the cultural impact of it. And this, I can see why high schoolers read it. And it doesn't come across as Macbeth or as like you're reading it because it's a quote unquote classic. It's like in a world, it's kind of weird. In a world that like, or in a country that Uncle Tom's Cabin is the most important piece of black literature in whatever way, written by a white woman. But it's like a Raisin in the Sun is this weird thing that I would rather be taught. I think you should have the Sermon on the Mount, or or I Have a Dream, and then the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then A Raisin in the Sun should be kind of like, not even this is what we're reading this February for Black History Month, but here's the 3 trimesters of our school schedule. This is what we're going to get to encompass the black experience in modern America.
Yeah, instead we choose like, To Kill a Mockingbird, where it's like, oh, well, the white people are helping.
Which is great. I will defend.
I love the book.
Yeah.
I love the book. I will defend the book, but like this is the one we choose that it's like, oh, well, we can all get together. Like this kind of thing. And I like, so Ossie Davis, who is an actor who played the role of Walter at some point in Broadway, he said, this is a quote from him, that's like, one of the biggest selling points about Raisin was how much the Younger family was just like any other American family. Some people were ecstatic to find that it didn't really have to be about Negroes at all. It was rather a walking, talking demonstration of our mythic conviction that underneath all of us Americans, color ain't got nothing to do with it, are pretty much alike. This uncritical assumption, sentimentally held by the audience, powerfully fixed in the character of the powerful mother with whom everybody could identify, made any other question about the Youngers and what living in the slums of Southside Chicago had done to them not only irrelevant and impertinent, but also disloyal, which is a really intense quote. But it kind of leads to 2 points where it's like, this is universally relatable in a way. So it's universally relatable in the fact that like even the title comes from a Langston Hughes poem,
Yep.
Harlem Dream Deferred, which is kind of about, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Which these are themes, and like having no idea what you're doing with your life and feeling that the future is like this oppressing blanket that's going nowhere. Like these are themes relatable to everyone, but at the same time, comes in with this style of blazon that it's like, yeah, these are relatable, but
Yeah.
this is not relatable to everybody. This is the modern Black African American experience.
And yes, and that's why, because exactly the Langston Hughes, because he's such a profound cornerstone of like Black literature and the Black identity in the 1900s, and that is such a simple. Like you said, it doesn't have to be about Black people if I don't want it to be, because it's a true point that at every point in the story, each character is met with yes, it is more beneficial to just defer your dreams and push them aside until it's a good time to pursue them. But that time is never technically ever going to come.
Totally. And
so like Mama has this like dying house plant. It's like, why do you have a house plant? It doesn't even make any sense. We don't even get the sun. And she's like, well, because this is what I want to do. This is what I want. And so I'm going to make it work.
Yep.
And there's a lot of, that's like the lowest tier version of that. And it just kind of escalates throughout the play. And yeah, it's sort of, I can see why it took off then and why it continues to resonate now, because there's that same sort of, we're Scottish, we're Irish. And so what does it mean to actually be Scottish or Irish? That's what Benny explores when she's wearing the traditional dress of that. And there's this quote, just to encapsulate sort of what you were saying, that I can't remember who said it, but it was like 10, 20 years ago, that like the problem with America, and everyone loves to have their, what's the problem with America? But he's like, here's our actual like flawed thinking, is that everyone sees themselves as a temporarily disadvantaged millionaire.
Totally.
Like we're going to make it happen. I'm just kind of down on my luck. And I love her casting that in a way that's like humanizing the African American experience of let me not assimilate it to white people of like, isn't this so tragic that they're living just like you and they're not doing that well. It's like, no, they're living their version of you, and you can see how cool that is and how emotionally you can empathize with that.
Relatable, yeah.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, half of them suffer from that poison of like, we'll be millionaires someday, like his dad Walter says to his son, of outlining this giant American dream, whereas Ruth just wants a kitchen, and not a kitchen because she's a woman. She's like, I just don't want to be in this closet anymore.
Yeah, totally. Wonderful play. Really cool that produced in 1959, presaged the Black Revolution, the women's consciousness revolution, feminism revolution, and way ahead of its time, very stylish in the way that it presented the story. And we thought it was a very stylish arrival. A Minor Diner would not be possible without the continued support of our sponsors. These days, home ownership might feel like a dream deferred for you in our increasingly expensive modern life. Sure, Sean can buy a home in Austin or Denver, but some of us work for a living. Most home prices are skyrocketing while our wages are staying the same. But what if we told you you were looking in the wrong places? Hoi Polloi Housing, LLC is here to show you achievable shelters hiding in the overgrowth of America's cities. Flip an 1800s brownstone in West Englewood, Chicago, with some of the copper wiring intact, starting from $15,000. Achieve liberation by building your perfect home on an empty lot in Forest Park, Detroit. Live your off-grid, carbon-neutral dreams in an estate with no electricity or plumbing, starting from $5,000. Come visit our Hoi Polloi office, located on the other side of the tracks.
Are your eyelids drooping through your Monday morning Zoom meetings? Are you finding it hard to fully wake up without leaving your own house? Is it tough to get excited about your $95,000 a year Python programming job? Master your mornings with our unique, exotic blends of economically priced coffee. Free yourself from the chains of suburban boredom with a dark roast harvested by young, nimble hands in sunny Honduras. Close big deals confidently with a cup of joe squeezed from hard-working, underprivileged Brazilians. 16-ounce bags for as low as $10, sent directly to your home. Why pay $20 for organic, ethically made coffee when you could experience the world with a sip of our ethnically made ground java? Stop suffering. Order today.
And we are back now with our entree, which comes from the capital of Australia, Canberra, Australia. It's from a man named Genesis Owusu. That's not his birth name. He was born Kofi Owusu Ansah in the town of Koforidua in Ghana. He was born in Ghana in 1998, which makes both I and the treble chef feel pretty old.
Yes.
But anyways, born in 1998 in Ghana, moves to Australia with his whole family when he is 2. Has lived in Australia ever since, and this is his debut album. It's called Smiling with No Teeth. Did you know anything about this guy before listening to this album?
I didn't, because I try to stay up on what's going on in Australia in general, but their music scene is kind of not weird in a derogatory way, but like they had a weird wave in the 2000s, and I haven't really paid attention since like Eskimo Joe and weird indie artists like that or whatever, but no, I was not familiar with him whatsoever.
Because they've always had, Australia's always had like a very vibrant music scene, but I feel like it's been in certain genres.
Yeah, like they can crank out a one-hit wonder like nobody's business. For sure.
There were a ton of like Australian indie pop bands.
Yeah.
10 years ago. I like a pretty solid Australian indie rock scene 20 years ago. And now I think of Tame Impala, King Gizzard, and the Lizard Wizard, like a lot of kind of, I wouldn't call Tame Impala scuzzy, but like some scuzzy rock music.
Yeah,
you're drinking with your bros, and you're throwing down some psych riffs. That's what I think of Australia.
Yeah, because like every once in a while I'll go back and listen to the actual like indigenous music with like the didgeridoo and singing about Uluru and stuff like that, but anytime they have that famous radio station like Triple J, I think is what it is, and they usually do a huge countdown every year, and their guests are always Ariana Grande, whoever else is flying over there from the States.
Yeah,
and they're usually like jet lagged to death, and it's usually kind of a weird interview. So it was super cool to. I don't want to say anything derogatory about his age, but such an insanely young guy. Putting out something that's not only like incredibly good, like for what it is, but as a debut effort, is kind of it's not a one-hit wonder because it's a 55-minute album.
55-minute album, stuff. And most of it's really good.
Yeah.
So, what is Smiling with No Teeth? It's basically like, unlike that scuzzy psych rock that I was talking about, this is like super smooth. A very super smooth amalgamation of like neo soul. It's got a lot of funk flavor. Kind of sound like almost Kendrick Lamar-y, like Top Dog Entertainment style hip hop. It's got some post punk in it.
Yeah.
It's got some just like a little bit of everything, all mashed together, and it somehow like manages to fit in all of these different genres and like never feel all over the place. Like it starts with this song On the Move, which is not really like it doesn't really let you know what you're getting in
not
for.
At all. Yeah.
Because it starts out and it's like a really kind of uber aggressive, almost like Death Gripsy song. Like he's barking over some kind of aggressive like hip hop beats, and then suddenly this like really nice synth arpeggio comes in, and you're like, okay, I'm grooving a little bit, and then just like breaks down into like a D'Angelo soul song.
Yeah.
Like all under 2 minutes.
Yeah, as like a perfect microcosm of the album itself.
Yeah.
Because like you're not supposed to, there are no rules in art, but you know, there are things that people generally respond to, and there are limits to the container you should have. And like a 55-minute debut album isn't advisable.
Yeah.
And doing one that's like it's not really explicitly any genre, and even when you could say that, and also it's like too many genres, like sporadic, whatever, but it all flows and it's all cohesive and it all like has a arc to it and a theme to it.
It's almost like a concept album, which we'll talk about the concept more. I want to start out with a personal story of the Treble Chef and I, because before we opened the A Minor Diner, I remember we were having a conversation, and I was about to release an album of mine as I make music on the side when I'm not, cooking here in the diner. And I made a comment to you kind of saying that, like, sometimes it feels really meaningless to release music, right? Because the chances of whatever music you release just languishing in obscurity forever are not only likely, that's what's going to happen.
The statistical reality.
Statistical reality is like, it's like winning the lottery. Like, you're not going to win. Sorry.
Yeah.
You're throwing away your money in the lottery, and you're throwing away your time to make music. And that's kind of how it was feeling to me at the time as I was kind of mixing this album. And you made a comment, Treble Chef Jesse, about that, like, yes, you're probably going to languish and die in obscurity, but at the same time, that's almost liberating in a sense, right? Because you have no you have no shareholders, you have no stake in making a great, album. You can do whatever you want, and you made a comment about just like making the biggest swing that you can.
Yeah. It's sort of like the context in which this is going to sound like a total sidebar to that, but it's almost the same thing. Okay. Where like if you're doing, She's Vaporous, the wonderful album, one of our favorite, also on the menu dishes, but you're doing that, and it's like there's like no context to it whatsoever. Like the listener is going to find it and engage with it independent of you. Recently, as of I think like yesterday, Lil Nas X put out a new song or a new EP or album or whatever, and there's this video of him, and he's like ascending to heaven on like angel's wings or whatever. Okay. And keep in mind, like anyone who's listening to this is like, okay, this is this kind of like interesting guy, but at the end of the day, he's the Old Town Road guy or whatever.
Yeah.
And so he's like ascending to heaven or whatever, and then this like pole appears, and he like pole dances on the pole all the way from like heaven down to hell. Oh. And it's like fun and funny and interesting or whatever. But it's exactly that. Like some people are like, what the heck is this? Yeah. Because they're like, I like the country song he did.
I like that one with the Cyrus guy. The Achy Breaky Heart guy.
Yeah, and that song is insane, by the way, because I remember that was like a delight of 2020 of all things, or 2019, whenever.
2019, I think.
Like every week there was a new remix of that song with a new person on it. But that's sort of the thing, is he's that guy. And so you get Radiohead, where they have Creep, and they don't like that, and that's kind of stuffy and pretentious on one end, and the other end is like, we accidentally did something we didn't want to do.
We accidentally did something that doesn't actually like sum up what we were trying to do.
Yeah. And so then Genesis Owusu comes in, and it's this weird, exactly what I like in an artist of, okay, so what is his second album going to sound like? It's like, I have no idea. Yeah. And I think that's great and he's earned that in a positive way, because he comes in, like you mentioned, like I think you've said Prince before in comparison to him, and same with like Death Grips and stuff. Like the song Drown reminds me of like a Bruce Springsteen song. The song About Fishing reminds me of a Sonny and Cher song. Oh yeah. And then No Looking Back, I think, is literally like the chord progression of the Full House theme. Like it's like, and it's like, I don't, as ridiculous and weird and memey as that sounds, it's actually not. Like it's all very good, and it's all very cohesive. Yeah. And he has this, he's very aware that he came from Africa to Australia at 2 years old. So he can't claim to be, he has that sort of approach that like, I mean, I am African by birth and by ethnicity, but I'm speaking English. Like his accent is just, it's not even Australian, like in a strong way.
Yeah. And I've never heard the guy speak. I've only heard him because he kind of dabbles in this, how would you say, kind of like beat poetry-ish kind of style here and there.
Yeah, like
and
Def
it's way
Jam.
less cringy than it sounds.
No,
it's
exactly.
actually really well done. But I read a couple interviews with the guy, and I have never met somebody from Canberra, Australia. You might be surprised to know that this is the capital of Australia and not like Sydney or Melbourne or even Perth, like these cities that like are relatively well known and that actually, have a music scene and everything. So this is where young Kofi Owusu Ansah is not dropped by his parents, but that's where the family moves, right? And he said other than his brother, he was the only black person in his entire primary, secondary school experience.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because he's you look at A Raisin in the Sun and it's like, okay, the problems are going on then are also happening now.
Yeah.
But he's born in 1998. I remember 1998. Like I was
just watching Cat Dog all the time.
Yeah, Cat Dog might have been just after that, but yeah, definitely. But because Australia, I know in the last dish I just said that like America's kind of this unique whatever like idea. But Australia is kind of our cousin or brother or sister country where it's English founded, and Australia is full of nothing but like colonial English people, and then technically like Maori people from New Zealand, Aboriginals from native to there, people from Oceania in general, a ton of Chinese people, and I guess some significant Indian population.
A large immigrant population of all sorts of shapes and sizes, basically. Like Australia is a very kind of analogous country to the United States in a lot of the problems that we both have.
Yeah.
Like in terms of for lack of a better term, eradication of its native population, large kind of melting pot, ethnographic makeup of the country, and its English colonial background. So it was kind of interesting. This album, and I don't mean it as like a knock on Genesis Owusu. It feels very American. It feels like something that would be coming out of like 2015, 2016, like in between like the Kendrick Lamar To Pimp a Butterfly album and the last Thundercat album. Like he would fit in with that theme or that scene perfectly, but he's completely outside of it.
I agree because he's got this interesting, like you say, he's from Canberra, and the only other person I've ever met was a native Chinese young woman, an actress that was from there and did the same quiz of like, guess what the capital of Australia is. And he has this weird, the point I'm going to try to make here is like you're saying, the same sort of racial tensions and issues of their past. There's a not incredibly good movie, but a movie on Netflix called The Sapphires.
Okay.
And it's about these Aboriginal young women, and I'm not sure what you would call it. It's not a reservation out there, but it's their community, deliberately made to be their community in the 60s. And they're good singers, and they do like country music, American country music covers for the people in the white towns. And the people in the white towns don't like them, but the visiting Americans like them. And so the visiting Americans bring them to Vietnam to entertain the troops in Vietnam.
Oh, weird.
And it sounds like a great movie, but it's not that good. But it's based on a true story.
It's a great idea. It's a great story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's sort of the same thing where they are going to give because they interact with a lot of African Americans, and it's like this like they're treated exactly the same, but also not the same at all, because it
Yeah.
means something different in Vietnam to be Aboriginal versus Black. But at the end of the day, that's different than being Vietnamese or American. There's this, like, you put it with like I think that's Brain Feeder is who, like Flying Lotus and Thundercat, and then I don't know who Kendrick is.
Top
also.
Dog.
Yeah, and it's like, as far as I'm concerned, Kendrick and To Pimp a Butterfly is like the extreme high watermark of I want to make a political, cultural statement as an album. Whereas from there, it's sort of devolved into an aesthetic that's like commenting on things. It's just sort of flying a sort of transparent flag. But Genesis Owusu has this, he really puts a hat on it, or he hangs in screenwriting, when you want to make something obvious, but let the audience know that you know that it's obvious, you call it hanging a lampshade on it, of just pretend that it's not there kind of thing, but I'm acknowledging it's there. And he does that with like, I'm going to be this direct about what it means to be Black in Canberra at this time. And that's not going to be the entire point. He has a very, like we talked about the monolith with Raisin in the Sun. He says like, it does mean this to be Black, and I don't want to say it comes with advantages or disadvantages, but he says like, he views it from a multifaceted, multi-angled, I guess, every experience. Because I think he talks about like the broader, overarching, like worst parts of discrimination. Yeah. But then like also the very passive things that he thinks about a day or a week or a month later of, oh, that was actually racist. Yeah. I didn't think about that they were saying that to me specifically. Which
kind of ties into that concept that we alluded to earlier, where so last month as part of our featured meal, we featured Arlo Parks, who, you know, interestingly enough has this, again, like multi-ethnic background, but is living in Britain as part of the, you know, African diaspora in some way, shape, or fashion. But one of the themes of that album last month was the black dog, which is just, you know, a pretty well-known metaphor for depression, right? And Genesis Owusu very early on has a song here called "The Other Black Dog," and he's talking about how not only is black dog a familiar metaphor for depression, it's also a racial slur that he had himself been called many a time growing up in very, very white Canberra.
Because he sort of uses that as a motif too, because I think he talks about black dog in a song not named it, and he might be referring to depression, because that's another overarching theme, is that he's talking like in Raisin in the Sun. What is the tangible result of racism is that they're not able to get out of this apartment and not be able to move to better places, more friendlier places with more jobs. And he spends most of Smiling with No Teeth saying like, okay, but here's the actual, not PTSD, he's not being triggered, he's not any of these good or bad words that any right or left American would use, but he's using like, okay, but here are the psychological effects of being put into a box, good box, bad box, whatever, of if I'm called a black dog, that it's not even that it begins to wear on him or taken as a compliment. He's like, here's the trajectory of what happens from childhood going with that. And I think it's a weird accomplishment to, like, everything about this album is, you wouldn't tell him, okay, don't do that, like deliberately don't do that. It's like, okay, it's safer if you don't do it, safer for you. No one's gonna punish you for it, but like you're saying, you're just gonna become one out of 100 billion albums released today if you do all this stuff. You're distilling your voice, and it's a weird mark of like actual confidence, because I think there's bravado and there's this weird chest thumping thing that we as Americans, I can't speak for Europeans or any other culture, but we as Americans, we love to thump our chest of like, this is my identity, this is who I am, this is my hardships, and these are my triumphs. And he doesn't do that, like in a way that like you're comparing him to those sort of artists. That's kind of a trap that you can fall into, where you can be like Common, or like Chicago rap in the early 2000s or whatever, of a little bit too heady and intellectual to really connect with mainstream.
Oh, okay.
Or you can be like you're saying, superficial, materialistic, like the South was in the 2000s as well, I guess, like Lil Wayne and
There's
things
some
like
Atlanta,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, but then he just has a very deliberate, I'm going to make a somewhat tangible but somewhat abstract concept out of exploring what this means to me.
Yeah, very similar to our appetizer in that I feel like A Raisin in the Sun has a lot of kind of universally relatable themes in the sense of, feeling like you might have a lack of upward mobility, or kind of the makeup of a family, like very universally themes that can apply to anybody. But then underneath all that, or even above all that, if you want to put it that way, there are these very locally kind of black issues that are driving the entirety of the play. And similar to this album, where it's like there are some universally relatable themes here, like depression. Every 22-year-old in the entire world is depressed, and there are some songs like "Don't Need You," which the chorus is just basically saying, "Wait, I don't need you," and that could be talking about an ex-lover, or it could be talking about depression itself. Like, hang on, I'm not as tied to you as I thought I was. So universally relatable, but then if you get a little deeper into it, it's talking about like very black issues and how that universally relatable issue is kind of seen through the lens of now like a black Gen Z person.
Yeah.
Because there are some differences. We're not 1959 now. And he was even talking about his upbringing, that it's like, okay, I'm the only black person in this entire school. So whereas he said his brother kind of made as much an attempt to assimilate and be quote unquote normal as he could, Genesis kind of went the opposite direction. It was like, okay, if I'm gonna be the weird one right off the bat, like I'm gonna lean into that, like I'm gonna own it.
Yeah.
And I feel that a lot in his music. I think it comes off that way as well. That just like I was saying, like taking the big swing, like the biggest swing that you can. This feels like a very big swing.
Yeah, I think it's that because this is a bad thing in America, that like when for the last 200 years, whatever, when you're talking about anyone different from you, you view them as like, let's say it's a woman, right? And I don't agree with that woman, so I'm going to call her shrill, or I'm going to call her assertive or bossy or whatever,
or some meaner words.
Yes, exactly. That's the most polite way you could put it. And it's the same sort of thing with literally any ethnicity, discussing any other ethnicity, that dominant versus minority groups. But like Genesis Owusu has this humility to him as well, that he's not ever, as diverse as the album is, like sonically, and as ambitious as it is at 55 minutes, he's taking broad swings and big swings, but only the ones he knows he's going to like, I'm either going to get a base hit or a home run on this sort of thing. Because there's this book, I cannot quite remember the author's name, but it's called The Person You Mean to Be. Dolly Shug or something
Parton.
like that. Yes, Dolly Parton wrote that as well. Dolly Shug, and she talks at the end about this because it's sort of about the business world and modern American life, of like how do you fight for social change and social injustice and things like that, but not also step on toes and betray who you are as a person. Sorry, that's the main general point that I'm getting at by bringing up that book, is that she's saying you cannot end racial inequality and racial injustice because it's a constant thing. Like, so long as race and ethnicity exists, an example she brings up in the book is Japanese people are very prompt and on time, whereas Peruvian business leaders, it's offensive to show up on time. You want to show up 15 minutes later because it's a bit too demanding of time.
Okay.
So when Sony works with this company in Peru they're both very competent, whatever people, but they have to constantly learn and like tectonic plates, basically, is their argument.
Which is because there's the other kind of non-argument of a lot of business leaders, white people, a lot of people that are like, well, I'm colorblind.
Yes.
Like we just have to treat each other all exactly the same because then we would solve everything. But it's like, no, that's just ignoring a lot of history, and B, it doesn't work that way. And honestly, one of the standout tracks for me in Smiling with No Teeth is called I Don't See Color, which is, first off, just such a cool song because it starts out and there's just like this kind of like minimalist kind of just bass drum instrumentation. Like it's a little kind of off kilter sounding, it's a little industrial, but like it's really minimalist. And then there's just like one repetitive voice sample, but then the lyrics I think are some of the best on the whole album, saying when you see the Arab man, it's the bombs and flares. When you see the Asian man, it's the yellow scare. When you see the black man, it's riots and terror. But when I talk about slavery, you weren't there. How convenient.
Because then he, just to also assist with that, because then I think his second verse is like he flips that. Of he's saying something like, not in a conceding way, like same with Raisin in the Sun, but he's like, but I also wasn't there. So it's really hard for me to talk about, and I think he's not referring to like slavery, but like even just his parents, of like, I can't really actually speak on behalf of the past generations' trials and tribulations because I'm not, and that's why I like it, is it hits that gray area that, the colorblind argument, that he's able to, again, for someone born in 1998, and he's not that younger people are stupid, but it's like you have to experience some of these things, and it's sad that what's probably the result of that experience is like, I remember when I was 6 and this happened and that happened and this happened.
Totally. But it's kind of interesting with that he's talking about that. I wasn't there, but there's also kind of a theme that comes up in a few different songs that is that monolith that we keep talking about. And so a lyric says, how you think you're gonna move when it's bigger than you, brother. And there's a lot of there's this theme that it's like, okay, I wasn't there for all of this stuff. I am not representative of the Ghanaian diaspora or black people as a whole, but I'm kind of expected to be. And that's the idea of like, it's bigger than you, because a lot of people, despite thinking that they are colorblind, they're seeing the actions of one black person or one white person or one Middle Eastern person as the entirety of that that race, tied back into A Raisin in the Sun, where we're just the lowest race. We're the like, because of how we were born, we can't be doctors or whatever. Just thinking of race as this kind of one size fits all monolith, when in fact it's not.
No, exactly. Because like, just 2 offhand like personal anecdotes. When I was over in Beijing, there was an African American guy over there, and we were asking the people we were working for, like, okay, well, he needs a haircut. He's an actor. He needs a haircut. So where's he going to go for? Oh, it's just right down there. No, he needs like a African American haircut because they have different hair, and he's the one saying this. And they're like, oh, well, that's, 15,000 miles that direction in this other district of town. And just like the Raisin in the Sun thing of like, well, we're perfectly, we don't see race, we don't see color whatsoever, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But it is incredibly inconvenient to go onto this other side of the tracks, that you have to go to this other place and it costs you more and blah, blah, blah. And it's the same sort of thing with, I was speaking to another actor on that, Chinese American. And after we wrapped what we were shooting, I think we stayed up from like 7 until like 7 or 8 or 9 in the morning, just talking about his experiences as a American-born Chinese, because he's a little bit similar to Genesis Owusu, where his mom is Chinese. He was born in, I can't remember which province in China, and then came over to California as a 3, 4, 5-year-old. And there's this weird, I'm glad that we're seeing it now, but there's this monolithic, self-imposed and externally imposed on Asian Americans in especially like the West Coast, where they say, and it's a rough word. I don't want to say it as a white person, but it's speaking on, from our conversation. He was saying, like, we are taught to be the model minority, like just shut up, get good grades, go to work, because we saw what happened to the Native Americans. We saw what happened to the African Americans. We saw what happened with just the migrant, who am I thinking of? The
Latinx
Chavez, not Cesar Chavez, I think maybe Cesar, but the early labor movements. And it's like, we already had it bad enough when they were firebombing Chinatown and things like that. And so we're just going to do this. And it's this sort of, as she depicts in Raisin in the Sun, this cycle that, like, it's enforced. The walls are put there by the oppressive force on the outside, but then on the inside, it's like a whack-a-mole. If anyone is behaving not of our monolith, we need to, for protection, keep them in this box, if that makes sense.
Interesting.
And like Genesis, I find it interesting because there's some... I would be curious to see what other artists, like other household name artists, think of this album, because Kendrick can do some fun things on Pimp a Butterfly, where he's there's that what's that the comedic monologue that he does that's like, this isn't free, whatever. He's like, it's like
this
he
shit
can
ain't free.
he can do that, or like Kanye at the end of Blame Game can do like these sorts of whatever. Genesis has some like straight up like cheesy, like I was saying, the No Looking Back song is like literally Full House sounding, and it sounds very Australian, and I don't mean that in a good or bad way, but like you guys have a different temperament down there. But I find it very I would wonder if he had some sort of formative experience or watershed experience to get him into music, like who his idols were, because for such a young, what is that? Like he's like 21 now or 22 or something. Yeah, it's like
dude's 22
to come out of the gate, because Justin Bieber was young at one point too, and same with a lot of other artists. I think Tupac and Biggie especially was pretty young when he started, and to come out of the gate with like, here's a pretty reasonable, interesting gray area. How does race relate to music and to art and to civilization in Australia? Is pretty profound. And any sort of second album out of him, unlike a lot of other artists, I don't think he's a one-trick pony whatsoever.
I think there's too many styles represented here, and there's too many styles that are done well represented here to be like, oh well, he's out of ideas entirely. There's like so many good things that he does here that he could go on any number of paths in this second album and like knock it out of the park.
Because even just briefly, just to comment on that, like you can attempt a bunch of different sounds, but actually like pulling them off is a different thing entirely.
Totally.
Like he does the whatever you generally want to call the technique. I'm going to take a female vocal sample and play it backwards and use that as my loop. Yeah, you and everyone else for the last 30 years, like I know. But in this, it's like, oh, this sounds good. This sounds like it adds something to the song. The texture makes sense. Yeah. So like he and his producers have sort of a finger on the pulse that, like, as an opposite example, recent Daft Punk or recent Weeknd or whatever, of like, it sounds pretty retro. And it's like, yeah, it sounds really soulless and elevator music where it's just aping a sort of sound.
Totally.
And he sounds like, I revere this sound from people who came before me, and here's my version of it. I'm going to move the needle a little bit with it.
I mean, I'm endlessly impressed that, like, I'm not sure there's that trap hi-hat beat thing on the entire album, which is like the reason that hip-hop is like losing me, because so much American hip-hop sounds like it is just like copy and paste producer beats over and over and over again. And I think something that's interesting about this one, so instead of featuring a bunch of different producers, Owusu basically like sat down with a band, and had this full band, like a Kieran Callanan, who is relatively famous, plays guitar on the whole thing, and there's a bass player and a drummer and a keys guy, and like they wrote the majority of the album just together, the 5 of them.
That makes sense.
And I think that's why it sounds so cohesive, despite having all of these different genres, and it also just sounds so like smooth and put together, and I think that's why it's probably just, like 5 friends that are just banging out some tracks.
And this would be like, because I'm often, and I do generally feel this way, and there's a few exceptions to the rule in my case, like the democratization of music and like taking away the gatekeepers and all of the institutions. I agree with like the fundamental ethos of that, but I think the results have been catastrophic. Like I think anybody, in, like you're saying, the trap beats, like what you said is like a pretty huge exaggeration while simultaneously being insanely true.
Yeah.
They're all the same time signatures. They're all the same sound libraries. They're all the same completely.
They're all the same piano line half the time. Like, Jesus.
And it's all Fruity Loops, just general Pro Tools nonsense. But then you get this, and it's like, okay, this objectively wouldn't have come out 20 years ago or any time before that. You're not going to get a record label or record company saying, yeah, go ahead, go fool around with a band and sing about this kind of stuff for this long on your debut album. They would want to brand him and do this and that and this and that. And this is like, not this particular album, but hopefully the 2020s is like the dawning of the era of like, okay, finally democracy takes root in art and people get some discretion that 90% of it is still trash or whatever, but we are now regularly cranking out genuine, authentic statements. Like I'd be curious to hear her experience trying to get Raisin in the Sun made, because I can imagine it just, you already get 300,000 no's as a white male playwright who's written a bunch of plays.
Totally. For
her to take that swing, because she knew she could in the same way that he knew he could. It's an incredibly, like, we get to that first song and it was just this, like, there's this clip in Jay-Z's documentary that I always refer to, the Fade to Black or whatever, when he's retiring, and Timbaland plays him the Dirt Off Your Shoulder clip or whatever, and Jay-Z just looks like disgusted at it in terms of like how much he likes it. He's like, what the heck is this? And that's how I felt during this. I was just like, this is disgusting how like good this is. This is stupid. I hate this. This is going to ruin my day.
How well put together this is. I like first listen and back-to-back listens. I've started to like it more and more as like a cohesive whole. But then like the first time I heard it, there were like a handful of songs that the first time I heard them, I was like, jazzed. And that doesn't happen very often for me. Like this is, for me, in this young year, like very head and shoulders the most exciting thing I think I've heard this year.
I agree. I think like Centerfold is either like the second or third song. Heard that and was like, okay, well this is now top tier instantly. Like even if the rest of this sucks, this is great.
It's like Centerfold onto Waitin' on Ya, which is absurdly good, into Don't Need You, which is just so catchy and just so well put together. And then there's Drown, which is you call it a Bruce Springsteen song because it's got that guy Kieran Callanan doing that "Ready Say Nowhere" like a Bryan Adams or something, and it works perfectly. And I'm like, what the fuck is going on?
No, exactly, because they're all. If you haven't gathered it by now, dear diners here, like it's not like poppy in terms of pop music or whatever, but they're like objectively competent compositions.
Hooks.
That are not like deep, like, oh, they're talking about this Ghana, Australian, hip hop, blah, blah, blah. No, like literally kind of hits every demographic.
Yeah.
Every song. You can play it for your grandma. You could play it at the club when the clubs open up again. You could play it driving and thinking about existential whatever. It's phenomenal.
It's a really phenomenal debut record. It is arriving in style for sure. We are really excited to see what this guy does soon. I'm also excited. I'm hoping the world can open up so he can come see us in a diner, or I can see him at a concert, because it sounds like a lot of fun to me.
Absolutely. For our dessert this month, we have a bit of an aged dish, but one that is aged to perfection. In the early 1900s, there was a serial killer named Harry Powers, and he would write what's essentially like Lonely Hearts letters, which is I'm a blank seeking a blank, looking for romantic partners. And he would meet women who were writing these same letters, marry them, take their money, and kill them. And so this happened a few times. And then in 1932, he was caught and executed. And so in the 50s, Davis Brubb wrote a novel called The Night of the Hunter, in which a similar figure does a similar thing. Novel concept. But Charles Laughton, who was a renowned English theater actor and director, read that book and loved it. And he called it a nightmarish Mother Goose story. And he got along very well with the author and was hired to direct the film, and it came out in 1955. And so The Night of the Hunter is about a religious fanatic who marries a gullible widow, and her young children are reluctant to tell him where their real dad hid the $10,000 he had stolen in a robbery. And this would be the first film that Charles Laughton would direct, but also his last. His one and only. And so there are a few different lenses that we can view the Night of the Hunter in regards to a stylish entrance, because it's inherently about a con man, and beautifully played. And also, Charles Laughton really kind of took a swing in the same way that Raisin in the Sun or Smiling No Teeth with No Teeth would take, where he said, it's 1955, we have color film, but I'm going to use black and white.
Yep.
And then not only am I not going to shoot this as like sort of a procedural whodunit, sort of mystery, weird sort of thing, he goes back to German expressionism and silent film.
Yeah.
And had you seen Night of the Hunter before this month?
I have wanted to see it for a long time, but just watched it for the first time about 2 weeks ago at this point.
Yeah. And here's the deal, diners. It's an objectively good movie.
It's so good.
As far as you can measure art's objectivity, there's a reason, because I went to film school, and so I saw it, well, actually after film school, but it's like a very Criterion sort of movie,
Totally.
Historical document, and it sort of like holds up in all sorts of different contexts. And in terms of a stylish entrance, like German expressionism and silent film visual language is what he chose to depict this story through. And it's a bit of a weird, if you made this today, which by the way, with any movie ever made, they're remaking it sometime soon.
It.
I think Universal's going to do it or whatever.
Oh dear.
But you would look at the film through the eyes of the religious fanatic is basically, it's kind of unclear whether he's actually an ordained priest or not.
Because the serial killer character, who isn't really a serial killer here.
Yeah, Robert Mitchum. Yeah.
Yeah. But he is either kind of pretending to be a preacher or is a preacher with like very low morals.
Yes, but because he knows he can at least quote the Bible, and he's got this like pitch perfect sales pitch to anyone with his like if you've ever seen Do the Right Thing, Spike Lee's film, where Radio has the two gold what would you call those not brass knuckles, but the knuckle plates there that say love and hate, and he's given this speech about love and hate. That comes from this, where Robert Mitchum has love and hate on his knuckles, and he's like winning over innocent townspeople by saying like, you know, there's so much hate in the world, and they're arm wrestling love and hate, but ultimately love wins. And if you were to try to make this today, you'd get pigeonholed into, okay, we need to see the events through his eyes or through the eyes of the children. And Lawton takes this, like, it's not, because you can see a lot of influence on directors like David Fincher has a bit of it here, where he's like, let's take an omnipotent view of the action, or Tim Burton, not so much from this film in particular, but the general expressionist, kooky, like
Totally.
exaggerated thing. But he presents things in a way that is, he's able to walk this tightrope that, like, the children who watch this film, not that it's meant for children, and I know Great Britain said it's an adults only movie, and a lot of religious groups.
I would be terrified if I saw it as a child.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it depicts, like you said, a nightmarish Mother Goose tale or whatever. But Robert Mitchum, this guy, and I suppose he can't be an actual preacher now that I think about it, because at the beginning, the first time we meet him, he's at like a burlesque show or a strip club or whatever, and he's not happy about it, but he's just sitting there. He walked into this place, and he's just sitting there enjoying it like everyone else would, or not enjoying it, but he's commenting on it.
And the knife goes off in his pocket.
Yeah.
It's a really good shot.
It's great. And then, so he goes to prison. They catch him for something.
He stole a car.
That's right. They run his plates or whatever, and he stole a car. And he gets sentenced, and he's in jail. And then the father of these children comes back to the family house, and he's stolen $10,000 in money. In money, in legal tender.
In money.
Yes, legal tender. But he, it's kind of interesting because I was trying to remember, like, well, wait a minute, how do they portray him as a good person? The dad as a good person. And it's that he wanted to steal from the rich to give to the poor, specifically the children. It's all about the children.
I'm not going to let my children be vagrants on the street.
Yeah.
I've got to give them I've got to take the money while I can.
Yeah. And it's like cool, and like a cool like technique. Then you go into the same courtroom, and the judge is the same, and the set's the same. You're like, oh, wait a minute. So naturally, of course he's going to end up in the same jail cell. And so they talk to one another, and he lets slip something about why he's in there stealing $10,000, blah, blah, blah. But he's going to be executed. The other guy just has to spend 30 days in jail, Robert Mitchum's character. And so he comes out naturally like, well, I'm a con man, and, it's basically the South, and I can go around and charm and woo whoever I want. Mm-hmm. So he goes and seeks out the widow and says, like, because your husband said I should come take care of you, and blah, blah, blah. And
pretends that he was working at the prison instead of locked up in the prison.
Yeah. And he's she's fine with that. She's wooed because he's handsome and charming enough and
this
personable.
Is back in the day, Great Depression era or whatever, where apparently you just married whoever turned up at the right moment, because they talk for like 4 minutes and get married the next scene. Yeah.
And again, in a way that's not like, oh, what a weird old movie. It's like they organically kind of make some half sense why they get together. And then the young daughter is like, I mean, whatever. I need a father figure. Like, sure.
I'm too young for this.
Yeah. But the son immediately is like, nope, not even close. Not even, he's a con man. Don't like him. I like that old guy out on the barge in the river. Yeah. Like, that's a father figure. And so the son has been told where the money is. Yeah. And I think that it's conveyed, or it's at least implied to this man, the con man preacher, that the kids must know at some point. Mm-hmm. And so there's this interesting thing, because Daniel Day-Lewis is he's very reverential of Charles Laughton as an actor.
Oh, okay.
And so there's this interesting, like, when I was watching it, I was like, oh, this is kind of a weird storybook Christmas card version of There'll Be Blood. Because Robert Mitchum, his performance is an extremely bold choice. Like, he has to be a mustache-twirling villain in one moment, and then someone that, like, adults are going to, like, fully fear and, like, oh, we could be corrupted this easily. Mm-hmm. Because the townsfolk, they're just charmed by him. They're not stupid, and they have all sorts of faults and follies and things like that, but they see it as being a good thing because objectively in the eyes of the town, he's coming to take care of this wife, this widow, and he's going to marry her, and he's, upholding his end of the deal. But then you get these moments that, like a German expressionist film, for you, The Deer Diner, would be like Fritz Lang's Metropolis, or
Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is very famous.
Yep, and like Nosferatu, which Nosferatu, when I was younger, I haven't seen Nosferatu, and I don't know if I'd have a problem with it now, but there's this episode of SpongeBob where they have to stay late at the Krusty Krab, and like all these bad haunted things happen, and they're all explained at the end except for who's turning on and off the lights or whatever. And then they look over and they're like, "Oh, it's Nosferatu."
Nosferatu.
Yeah, and he like is flipping the lights, and I'm like, that is the single scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. This image, and who is Nosferatu? And then because they just cut the credits, and I'm like, this is very disturbing. So he takes those sorts of images and those sorts of techniques that you'd see in silent films, and again, viewing it from 2021 standards, silent film kind of brushes right up against 1950s film. But it's like, that's like 35, 40 years difference of like filmmaking techniques.
And really, like, I mean, silent films, as would make sense. I mean, that was the beginning of film, right?
Yeah.
And so 1919, 1920, we're finally getting like the start of a lot of feature length, movies out of both Hollywood and other parts of the world. But by 1950 and 1955, Night of the Hunter, I mean, the film industry, especially the Hollywood film industry, is like, they've got it down pat at this point. And kind of so he's taken from German Expressionism, where, so if you watch like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it's like really over stylized, and it's really cool. It's really, really cool how they do it, but it's very over stylized. And I think even though Lawton says that he's taking from German Expressionism here, like, I don't think of it as over stylized, despite this film being fucking beautiful.
It's insane because like German Expressionism, like the quickest way to distill it down is if you remember the 1989 Batman movie that Tim Burton did. It's like, okay, buildings are going to be angular, and we're going to depict sadness as weird shadows and things like that. It's very, very stylized in that way. And he takes that, there's like two different directions he takes that in that I think make it, masterpiece is a word that gets thrown around a lot, like genius and things like that. But he has a very, very clear, this is the foundational narrative point of view we're going to take on this movie. He looks at things as if a child, when you're out in the daylight, everything is to proportion and everything is it makes sense. Your brain can make sense of it. But when you're a child, there's these ominous looking farmhouses that are larger than life, but they aren't incongruent with the world around it. He's not making, it's like, we're not in cartoon land all of a sudden. This is really, really disturbing, because when I think about this, like, I'm a child experiencing this now. Like I just talked about the SpongeBob episode. That's like incredibly hokey 1920s like makeup and film stock. But it's like, well, I remember the opaqueness of the white, like the angular, how he looks. Yeah. And so there's shots in this where he uses silhouettes and things like that to really, like, particularly, not to give anything away at the end, but there's not exactly a morally ambiguous like in A Raisin in the Sun, where what exactly should happen here? What do I want to happen? It's pretty obvious. But there's this woman who is like the Mother Goose character, essentially, and she's got a gun, and she is portrayed, she's backlit to whatever degree, so she's in complete darkness. But then outside the window is this manic preacher guy, and he's lit, and he's pretty white and everything. And in, classical visual language style, like the black cowboy hat means bad guy, white cowboy hat means good guy. Yeah. And so there's this ambiguous, and they're both singing the same song too. And it's like this really disturbing, this is what it meant to be a child, before the 90s. I'm just like, this is insanely, because there's like a Mark Twain angle to it too, where it's like a little bit Huck Finn, down Tom Sawyer down the raft, and it's this. He plays with those shapes and those angles and things like that. But then when you go to nighttime and you go to some of these interiors, fans of Wes Anderson, he has these incredibly deliberate sets built to depict an adult's bedroom, and it looks like a church. It looks like a cathedral. And if you look at the frame itself, 60-70% of it is completely black. Like it's almost like it's an illustration in a comic book or something like that. And then he's got this big triangle angled roof. And it's sort of, the genius of it is in silent film. If you go back and watch like Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton or things like that, they were not very confident in the audience's ability to pay attention to things.
No.
So they would do vignettes of like, here, focus on this, bug on the ground, or this hamburger. Watch what's gonna, or banana peel, or whatever.
Yeah.
And he does this like 1,000% subtly by saying like, if you don't need to be paying attention to it, it's going to be pitch black. It's not going to be a darker tree. It's going to be gone. Mm-hmm. And so inside here, what you see these bright lights on, it's a little bit like, I think Sin City came out in 2004.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that, where it's noir, but it's not trying to be cool, and it's not trying to be stylized. It's like the style is, this is what a child would view this as, and isn't that terrifying?
Yeah. It's just got such an interesting look for a film, and there's, again, we try to avoid spoilers here in A Minor Diner Land, so I don't want to give you the reason why any of this happens, but basically there's like a boat scene in the middle of the film, which is like just jaw-droppingly well filmed. Like it's very expressionistic, it's very artistic, it's very kind of opaque. And like to give you an idea of like where we were in 1955 Hollywood, like there's a review from Variety back in 1955 that says in this film there are, quote, too many offbeat touches that have a misty effect. And now so watching now, it's like, I'm sure this scene is one of these offbeat touches that, distracts from the story of this. Yeah. But like, it's easily my favorite part of this film. Oh, yeah. Like, it's just gorgeous. And like, I was looking back just to try to kind of place this and like, where is this in Hollywood time, And yes, we're dealing with kind of Orson Welles around the same time period, who is doing some new things within the Hollywood sphere. But most of the films around this time that I would say are just as stylistically striking do not come from Hollywood. I'm thinking like Diabolique from France. The Cranes are flying from the Soviet Union. The Seventh Seal from Sweden. Like all of these outside kind of independent or outside of Hollywood productions. And this is so out of time from 1955.
In basically every way, yeah, because going back to like humility, he was always very upfront with like Orson Welles came in and did Citizen Kane. I think he's like 24 years old, and Greg Toland was the cinematographer on that, and so he really relied on him a lot, but he was like, here's exactly what we're going to do. I'm confident about exactly what I want to do, and it worked in that case. But like Charles Laughton, he consults with his DP on like, I need to know what different lenses do and what different film stocks do. And then I think one of his camera ops or his assistant directors, like, why did he hire him? Well, because he won an Academy Award for a short film about traveling down a river. And so I should get him for the river sequence. And then the woman who plays like the Mother Goose sort of ish character at the end, she was a silent film actor. Mm-hmm. And she was like, why would you want me? And he's like, okay, back in the day, silent film, people would be quiet and they would lean forward to like watch a movie and be engaged in that way. and now they just sort of sit back and
They're eating
let it
popcorn.
Yeah.
They're not watching the screen.
Yeah.
I want to make them watch again.
Exactly. And so, like you're saying, Hollywood was quick to figure out what it wanted to be, and that happens by the time you hit like Wizard of Oz or Gone with the Wind, and they're like, this is what a Hollywood movie looks like. And there's not necessarily one person or one entity enforcing that, but it's like, here's what people like. And off the top of my head, other than like The Artist or things like that, like the last like black and white Best Picture winner was like 5 years after this, like The Apartment. But like that would be the last one where it's still kind of, audiences will go see a black and white movie because there's a choice, black and white or color. But yeah, he comes in, and basically he also, the way he shot it, instead of doing takes, he would just let the camera roll, which is great, especially for kids, because kids get, Clint Eastwood has this anecdote basically that he won't say action and cut on things. He'll just say like, okay, go ahead, or that's enough of that, or whatever. And it's because he was on so many Westerns, and if you yell action, the horses get scared and they all scatter and things like that. Yeah, so like holding the role is what you'd call that. Holding the role for kids is it like it eliminates that like that sudden rush of stage fright or anything like that. And I can only imagine what Robert Mitchum was going through, like getting to, because a negative way of saying, like a lot of Oscar bait movies, you call it chewing the scenery when someone's really just overacting and things like that. And he has, again, this sort of Daniel Day-Lewis, Daniel Plainview performance where he's not even like a human being. And he's this sort of like force for evil, yet also representing, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. It's a distinctly American character in whatever sort of way.
Well, because the entire, like a lot of the themes that character revolves around are like how could you put it, like the loss of God in American society, right?
Yeah.
And we kind of forget in our mostly kind of atheist young society now that like this was, you know, even portraying a potential preacher that like was evil and was killing people was like no. Like the Protestant Motion Picture Council rated the film objectionable and said that any religious person would be offended by it. The film was banned in Memphis, Tennessee. Like all these things that it's like, okay, so this was actually, you know, this is like a shocking idea here. Yeah, and so it's still like a very religious society, and that's kind of, despite Mitchum being kind of like a cartoon villain at times, he is actually genuinely pretty frightening.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is because of this kind of old style Southern religious preacher type, where it feels like he's bought in. Yeah. Even if he's using this just to further his own advantage, like it feels like he's super bought in, and it all kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it's a sort of because I read another one that like an organization, the Legion of Decency, said that this isn't a good movie.
Which is a killer hardcore band name.
No, exactly.
If nobody started a hardcore band called Legion of Decency, somebody's got to get on that.
I mean, that was one of our first choices for this dining establishment here was the
Legion of Indecency.
Yes. But yeah, like you say, because we tend to look back on things, isn't that so quaint? And the way they depict this or that is so, the art form is advanced so much. There's a murder scene in it that's like pretty rough. And then there's a moment where he's screaming at kids. And like there's a moment, especially when he screams in like frustration that he can't kill the kids. It's like, as a 1955 and you're watching this and like there's still... Again, there are very dark subject matters in all movies since the beginning of film, but he's like a true, religion throws like Footloose, it's like, this is a bad, anything and everything is bad. And I can't remember. I think it's called the Hays Code of like, you can't do anything until the 70s. You can't show two people sleeping in the same bed until then. But this is one of the ones where, like, when they were upset with the Last Temptation of Christ with Scorsese because he's depicting Jesus in a certain way, this one is like, okay, well, this guy is legitimately 9/10 of a preacher, like all the time. And then anytime he's not, he's screaming at kids, trying to stab people every 5 minutes. And I could see why they were a bit, I would argue, insecure about it, but in that sort of way of like, well, I guess there isn't that much that, behind closed doors. Yeah. Which I guess ironically, as the culture progressed, we learned some certain things. But it's again, as a entering with style. And, he paid for it. Like, Charles Laughton put this movie out, and they campaigned for it, and they tried to do some roadshow stuff. He was on The Tonight Show with the cast and this and that. Tanked. Critics didn't like it. Audiences didn't like it. Nobody liked saw it. Nope. And that's as bad as it started. And so he saw that as like, okay, I won't make movies anymore. Yeah. If people revere me as an actor and as a theater director, I guess that's where I'm meant to be. But nobody likes
me as a film director. No. This is just not for me. Which is, so, like, I didn't know that. I'm watching this movie, and, like, the boat sequence is going on, and I'm thinking in my head, like, I can't fucking wait to watch every last film that this guy has directed, because he is genius. And then I, like, letterboxed it afterwards. And I'm like, this is it? Yeah. This is the only one.
Yeah, because you'd think of something sinister. He died or this or that or heart attack or whatever. And he's like, nope, it's a pretty clear sign of... Because, I mean, there's not another way to put it. He went with a very unorthodox, like, villain sort of complicated thing. And I can't remember who Robert Mitchum is playing at the time, but kind of anti-heroes. But not this in 1955 America. And he made it super stylized, and he had complete control over kind of everything, got along with the screenwriter, everything. Complete failure. Yeah. So decided, okay, I won't ever do it again.
Well, and it's interesting because the whole the theme here today is we're arriving in style, right? And then we start with Lorraine Hansberry, who is a virtual unknown, takes a huge swing and succeeds, like becomes, one of the foremost playwrights of the time, and it's taken away from her from cancer, just a few years later, but she's in this role all of a sudden. And honestly, I see this happening with Genesis Owusu. Yep. I would be surprised if he does not have a very substantial sized fan base. We're not talking The Weeknd, but like a substantial sized fan base after this album is out for a couple years. Yeah. That just never happened with Laughton, where he took that big swing. He arrived in as much style as he could, and people were like, nah.
Yeah, and it's...
I want to watch a romantic comedy.
Yeah, and it's a tricky... Because he's playing with tonally... Because I would argue there's the general, almost objectively true philosophy that each new generation is more media literate than the one before it. So, like, we can watch things and compartmentalize and separate what we need to into the way. Mm-hmm. So it's an incredibly forward-thinking, in the exact same way, Raisin in the Sun, like you said, probably resonates... Because it's like, oh, black people are people because they're like white people or whatever. It like actually hits. This one, I think we come to respect children more, like in the 2020s compared to 1950s. Same with women, and same with this general, like you're saying, secularism, where even the most religious person will acknowledge, like, just because the preacher says it or the church says it doesn't make it from God, doesn't make it divine.
Well, Americans, there's still a few of them, but I get what you're saying.
Yeah, and so it's like this weird, that was the worst it ever got. And unfortunately, what I mean is his career, is that the worst it ever got was what got him to quit. It was like, okay, if I got a 0 out of 10 on the scorecard here, if I'm seen as a failure, I won't do it again. Because he's a pretty humble guy. But then the next year, 10 years later, the movie only keeps appreciating in value. I don't know anyone. I watched it with my parents the first time, and I like busted a gut laughing at like this part because he's saying he's looking for the kids or whatever, and then he's lying about where someone is and like where did she run off to? And he's like, oh, probably like this city or that city or one of those other Sodoms of the Ohio River. And it's like such a weird, like Robert E. Lee, like 1800s line of like Sodoms of the Ohio River.
Sodoms of the Ohio River, which was also a name for the diner we were considering.
Yes.
The Sodom of the Ohio River.
Yeah, because, yes. But it's like, it's just an interesting... like you're saying, pertaining to the theme. And especially, I guess, you can almost look at this however you want, a microcosm or a macrocosm of any of these particular specific characters or artists or the general theme as a whole, that you could distill this all the way down to Walter and his mom in that apartment that's like, I am going to grow a houseplant because I feel like it. Yeah. And like, this is objectively... Immanuel Kant would argue this is a good thing for me to be doing. And same thing with
I grow, therefore I am.
Yes, exactly. Well, exactly, yeah. And that release your music and you know, jam with that band, and it's pretty eclectic, and that's not going to work. 55-minute debut album, not going to work. Stylized German silent film for the American Christian audience, not going to work. Same white audience, white affluent audience, Black Chicago apartment living. Yeah, just take the swing.
Take the swing. Whatever that swing is, even if that swing doesn't work out.
If it's your swing, take it.
At least you took it. And that's our meal du mois. And if you didn't like that... Also on the menu this month, we have Indigo La End with Yako Himitsu. The Tokyo band, led by Enon Kawatami, also of Gesu no Kiwami o Otome, they write catchy pop rock hooks like their lives are depending on it.
Nick Cave and Warren Ellis just put out a new album called Carnage. The Dark Prince of Indie returns with one of his best albums ever, with a wonderfully orchestral and electric trip into the psyche.
Altin Gün Yol. These are Turkish folk tunes updated for an indie dance floor. It's perfect for doing embarrassing dance routines too, and for you to have a crash course in Anatolian folk rock.
Ote Oni from Guangzhou just put out her second album called Ming Ming. 我们喜欢她这种美貌的专辑听 Björk from Iceland, 在风台的魔法广场里慢跑.
Spangled Call Lilyline put out their 11th studio album this last month called Remember. The Japanese guys and gals in this mouthful of a band, they write some really cute and comforting, kind of mathy, sophistic indie. It's good stuff.
It's been a good month.
Yeah, lots of good stuff coming out.
You know, actually, I think we should have him. We should have him come back to the kitchen for a sec.
Let's have him come back to the kitchen. All right, it's time for notes to the chefs. So if you're new to A Minor Diner, we have notes to the chefs where we give you our wonderful diners a question to answer, and then we read some of your answers on the. To the rest of the diners, I guess you could say.
So last month's question was, what is your fuzzy blanket piece of art? Something that makes you feel comforted, happy, and secure. Brenda from South Dakota said, my warm fuzzy blanket is a cloth print of Buddha's footprint that my son got me in Myanmar after a barefoot temple trek by a Buddhist monk. I have the print hanging in my house, and to me it brings a feeling of calm. It represents that nothing is fixed or permanent. Change is always possible. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Cute.
Very good.
Nice. Cool. We next have a couple wrote us, a couple from Galway, Ireland. So we're going to read both of their answers. First, we have Claire. Claire chose Rusted Roots song Send Me On My Way because of the nostalgia it makes me feel. It reminds me of Matilda and Ice Age, while also just being a lovely feel-good song. And I agree. That's just a cute little tune.
Yeah, that's an interesting choice. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just like a nice little feel-good 90s
Yeah,
thing.
it's not disposable.
Yeah,
kinda
exactly. It's like it's a nice pop song without being like
a piece of caramel. Just kind of a
nice,
good afternoon.
Nice piece of caramel. We also have Enda from Galway, Ireland. He says, for me, I think it's Talking Heads, This Must Be the Place. I rediscovered the Talking Heads while living in Vietnam, and that was such a high point in my life, and that song is the epitome of that sense of belonging. I feel that the lyrics can literally apply to a loved one or a physical space interchangeably. So for me, the song is about Hanoi and my time there.
Yeah, that's a pretty beautiful evergreen song that just is very highbrow, intellectual, and also just really resonates.
That's what the Talking Heads were good at.
Yes, absolutely. And for our final note, Dane from Virginia, when asked, what is a piece of art that gave you hope in a time of hardship, your fuzzy blanket? He responded, this podcast, as in A Minor Diner. Which is a pretty stupid answer.
Which is just the worst answer.
I mean, it doesn't even actually make sense if you think about it. Not to get too far into the weeds, but I do think that is an idiotic statement to make.
Dane, you're cute, but we don't want you here back.
You are the first one on the wall. Do not serve. Dane from Virginia.
Dane from Virginia.
What would you say, Base Chef?
So this is an interesting question because I have a ton of songs and albums that I put on that feel really comforting to me. The Drive soundtrack, the
Real Human Being, yeah.
Oh my God, A Real Hero and Under Your Spell are two of the most perfect little songs ever written. A lot of work by like Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark, like a lot of 80s synth pop stuff, like makes me feel just like I'm wrapped in a blanket. But I decided to choose a movie to bring, and it is Peter Jackson's film Dead Alive.
Oh, wow, okay. I was like, The Return of the King.
Before
for sure,
he made The Lord of the Rings, even before he made like respectable films, he made a trio of the best horror gore things. And Dead Alive is perfect comedy, perfect gross out, makes me feel just warm and fuzzy inside for all of a bunch of weird reasons.
And that's an interesting one for Emile Demois because he's the opposite of a Charles Laughton, where he took his full swing, and they said, we've been trying for half a century to get Lord of the Rings off the ground. Maybe you can do it.
maybe you, Zombie Man.
Yeah.
Maybe you can do it.
Yeah.
And what about you, Treble Chef Jesse?
Well, it's a bit of a stretch, so forgive me and bear with me. But whenever I'm anxious or I'm down in a bad mood, I like to learn something new. So that it's like, here's what I did today on the calendar. I learned this fact or I learned more about this. And I find myself, if I can't sleep at night or if I'm feeling particularly down, the one thing that is always there for me is the Wikipedia page for North Korea. And that is because there is always a new link there. They're not always all purple. There's all those, the blue links to other pages. And so it's, what is their film industry like? Or what is Kim Il-sung's opinion on the Japanese or the Chinese or things like that?
Wow.
There's always a new rabbit hole to go down in that one. It's like a warren in that sense.
I am weirdly into reading like memoirs from people who have escaped North Korea.
Yeah.
It's like this weird thing. Hopefully one day we can feature here in the restaurant the Godzilla ripoff that they made in North Korea. Because wow. Boy, howdy, that's a story. But anyways, we love hearing from our patrons, and we like to bring some kind of thought-provoking questions for the chefs back here. So after this meal, we've kind of looked at 3 different pieces that they took that big swing, and they all hit, even if, people didn't appreciate it at the time. So for your question that we would like some awesome people to write in for, what is a piece of art that you think was ahead of its time.
Or one that is currently that exists that you feel is maybe misunderstood or not appreciated to the fullest extent.
Totally. So write into us. You can write in via email, aminordiner@gmail.com, or we are on Instagram @aminordiner. We're on Facebook @aminordiner, or you can find us on YouTube and just comment for us there.
Yep. So we would love to thank you for dining with us tonight. And so we will thank you because we'd love to do that. So be sure to thank your hostess on the way out, Miss Mandy Groves, and wave to Edward Tart on keys. He's been providing the accompaniment tonight. And thank you, Canberra, Australia, for... Canberra, whatever. I'm going to get in trouble now from the my Chinese friend and now my American friend here. A Minor Diner is recorded on location and produced by Epicene Motion Picture Company. So you all take care, and we will see you here next time.
See you here next month. See ya.